if viruses exist. So I mean, let's kind of get started on that. So Mark, my neighbor, you guys have heard him on here. He's a doctor, but you specialize in mind, body, health as your practice, and you help people, not just giving them whatever pharmaceutical is on TV at night that people see. That's probably the main.
Fair enough. I like it.
I mean, we all saw it. Every commercial that you watch in like the Super Bowl is every other one is for some medical thing, and it's terrifying. You brought in Dr. Martin Hart, and you have a whole different. You guys kind of are on the same plane, but you have obviously a whole different side of things. And we got some 5G talk. We got some mold talk. You just said if viruses exist, which is pretty mind blowing to hear because. I feel like most people are still stuck on the tropes of like, oh, in the winter you go out with your hair wet and you're going to catch a cold. And it's like, well, I don't think it works like that, Mom. I don't think that's how, I don't think that's how that works. But so do viruses exist? Do we want to start on that? Do you want to tell about your research a little bit more and what your practice does? Because you're based out not in Florida, right?
No, we're out of just south of Nashville, Tennessee. So we specialize in, we're coming from the alternative side, right? Alternative holistic medicine, where we're coming from there, kind of venturing into the integrative realm. Dr. Sylvester Mark's coming from the medical realm, venturing into integrative. And so we specialize a lot in mold illness, Lyme disease, neurological issues, autoimmune, that sort of thing, focusing on the holistic side. And Mark and I, Dr. Sylvester and I, met on that front of bridging some patients and have a beautiful setup of kind of bridging the two worlds in a cool way. But that's our background is really kind of bridging energy medicine, biological medicine, holistic world into a way that's very science-based. And that led me into some interesting realms of, do viruses exist, right? And so during COVID, there were some MDs who were making some videos and, YouTube, right? Like we all know, like take it, love it, watch it, and churn it. I'm like, okay. And then that same guy, Dr. Thomas Cowan, showed up at a conference I was at. And so he presented that he felt like viruses didn't exist, and he presented a lot of great data, and he put up his own money to rerun some of the studies to check on, do viruses exist? And so I go, okay, I'm seeing what this guy's saying. And one thing he did was with the COVID virus. And so the original studies that they published in 2020 to look at the COVID virus was they basically put it through this spectrum and they washed it with antibiotics, these cells. They washed it with detergent, and they looked at it with a microscope and saw what happened, right? And supposedly it was a virus-infected cell. And they said, okay, this cell infected with virus looks like it has spikes coming out of it. Looks like it has crowns, okay? And then Dr. Cowan said, hey, this looks weird. And so he redid the study without a viral infected cell, a normal, quote unquote, normal cell, washed it the same. Detergent, antibiotics, they had the same spikes. They looked exactly the same under the microscope. What they were saying were viral particles were stress particles. He repeated it 2 or 3 times with his own money, own researchers, found the same thing. And so then he started putting these studies out, looking at, was this what it was? I started diving deep. It's almost like black holes. We can point to all the things around a virus. We have a really hard time in the research pointing to a virus. That messed me up for a while, right? Like, what are we looking at? And then, so then what do we say? Like, how do we test for a virus? Okay, like, okay, do you have mono, right? You're in high school, you make out some gal, you get mono, you're out for a month. And the lab says you test positive. Well, the key is the lab says we have this little substance and we want to see if your blood reacts to the substance. Mm-hmm. And we call that substance mono. It could be crunched up leaves from your tree, and we're calling that mono. They're just calling that, it's a label for the substance they're testing against. Now, most labs are doing their best to call that, to do what they perceive as a viral test, but it doesn't matter. Each lab has a different assay, they call it assay, right? It's just a different substance they're testing against your blood. So a positive test is just whatever they tested against. It's whatever they're calling it. And so that gives you a positive test. My brain's like, okay, now I know testing for viruses isn't necessarily viruses. It's whatever they want to call it.
So they're basically more like, well, it's not this, so it has to be that.
Right. Yes.
Because they know what this is, and it's not that, so it's this.
Yes. If it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. But we don't actually know what a duck looks like or quacks like. We're just hopeful. And so then you go down, well, what about antiviral drugs? Most of those antiviral drug research is based on supporting the immune system, not killing viruses, right? So antibiotic drugs, when they test those, we can see a bacteria. We give you an antibiotic, it kills the bacteria. We can see that on the slideshows. We can see that in the blood. You can't see a virus in the blood, right? We can't look at the blood and see a virus. And so they had to look at, well, does it upregulate immune function? Does it downregulate inflammation? That's most of the viral research. And so when you go, okay, well, so I can't tell if you actually have a virus. I can only tell if what the lab says they call a virus, your blood responds to. I can't tell if the viral drugs actually kill a virus because all we're seeing is immune upregulation or downregulation of inflammatory markers. Okay. I can't look at your blood and see a virus. I can't look at it under a microscope and find a virus. Do viruses exist?
So they're just kind of shotgunning, like, well, we'll just help your immune system and whatever. If there's a virus, it'll fix it. We know it's not bacteria. We assume it's a virus.
It's sort of like we decided what X was, and then we do all the things around X with Y.
Yeah.
And if it fixes it, it must fix X. But we actually have never figured out what X variable is. It's like algebra, but nobody ever solved for X. We just assume the equation balanced.
And something that we have works.
Right.
To help your immune system. So it's kind of just like, well, just ignore the rest of the actual research of figuring it out what it is. That's very unsettling.
You know what? One of the first things I learned in medical school that was unsettling about viruses was, and the Western world has agreed on this for a long time, that they're not alive. Mm-hmm. And so you're taught one of the first things you learn in even cell biology and basic biology is what defines life. You know, its ability to reproduce and consume and have waste. And viruses don't meet that criteria. Yet after that day, we always talked as if they were alive. So that bothered me. Like, wait a minute, you made a big point to say these things are dead, but then they constantly refer to them as alive. So that made me question the possible identity of a virus. Some people even go so far, I don't know if you've heard this, about the electron microscope pictures. And some of them date back to the 50s and 60s of early viron particles, like a single virus. And I've heard everything from they're photographing the wrong thing to there's a global conspiracy to introduce misinformation into textbooks. But what's showing up on electron microscopes? That's a question we get a lot.
Yeah, so electron microscopes are a high-powered way to look at cells, right? They're looking deep in. And so when they say they're looking at a virus, they see the cell, and they see these little things coming out of the cell, okay? And they're calling those viron particles or virus particles coming out of the cell. What we know, though, is that a non-virus infected cell, when stressed, will produce those same particles, exosomes, right? Exosomes are basically a messenger molecule of our cells to tell the next thing what to do. When we say they're infected with the virus, what we're really saying they come out these viron particles is that all we can say is there's a stress response to the cell.
And when you say they're stressed, the cell is stressed, what do you mean by that exactly? Like there's an outside force of some kind pushing in on it?
100%. Could be a toxicity, could be an infection, could be lack of nutrients. Something that cell is wanting to tell the other cells, there's a problem here. Help, 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 help. Right? That's all we can really say based on the electron microscope readings, because even based on Dr. Cowan's studies where he repeated the COVID studies, it looks the same because that cell is stressed because you sprayed it with detergent and antibiotics, right?
Can they just not see that small? Like these viruses are smaller than the cell and we just physically can't see them on an electron microscope?
Exactly. They're smaller than small on that part. And I'm not saying that viruses don't exist. I'm just saying that we can't prove they exist reliably like we can prove bacteria or parasites or vitamins exist, right? It's a mystery. And so we have to some degree, quit kind of pretending like it's this done science. It's not. It's very ambiguous. And so when we look at like the electron microscope, or we look at, the research where we're trying to measure viral particles, we actually can't measure any of that. We're kind of making it up and calling it one thing. But it's really just an unfinished, abbreviated science. We're calling it an essay. We're calling it a book. And all we've written is part of an essay.
Yeah, so, people that leave medical school are basically starting at the assumption that that's already there and you don't need to look any deeper.
Right.
And it's like, well, you just treat them. There's no need to look farther than we can see.
Well, and kind of inherent in that is that the viron particle itself, via the germ theory, is the mechanism of dis-ease and an insult invader of the body itself. Whereas we've evolved millions of years with all kinds of viruses, new viruses, dead viruses, mostly thousands of active viruses, probably about 10,000 you get exposed to regularly. That you could say the same for prions, bacteria, protozoans, parasites. That's what we talked about last time, this terrain theory. So is it that you had an infectious agent like a virus that caused disease, or you had stress on the body that liberated a coexistent organism that we've symbiotically evolved with, or certainly should be able to keep at bay? Like, you should never get reactivation of these viruses either.
Well, it's like the simplest thing of like a placebo effect. You can trick somebody into thinking they have something, and the body will even act like they have something.
Oh, yeah.
So it must already be there if they can basically give themselves a tumor by thinking they have one. Right? I mean, am I crazy here, or is that actual...
No, there's a strong theory called the pleomorphic theory, which believes that a lot of infections, viral, bacterial, whatever, are pre-existent as low evolution states in our body already. And when the right state manifests, they can then evolve into pathogenic states called pleomorphic, where those, for instance, as a prion, are morphing into a state that's infectious, or a pre-bacterial state that already exists inside of us that might be symbiotic, it might be helpful, or just natural part of our biome. When the right state exists, it evolves into a pathogenic state that says, hey, I was a bully who had no muscles, and so I couldn't pick on anybody. I was just part of the system. Now I've evolved to have some muscles. I'm going to start punching kids in the face for lunch money.
Mm-hmm. So did COVID kind of spark everybody to start rewinding a little bit on, well, we are assuming we know all these things, so let's roll this back a little bit because we're basing this off of, 40s, 50s science?
Right.
And doctrine. Like we talked before, I was absolutely, I use the word brainwashed, but programmed is probably the better thing, based on the medical education industrial complex, that you want to eliminate all viruses, all bacteria, they're all bad. Like, oh, you've got a tummy ache, take an antibiotic, and kind of this broad spectrum disruption of the homeostasis a lot of times causes more dis-ease than the illness itself. And specifically viruses, absolutely, I was taught natural immunity is the best. So when I first got COVID, long before the vaccine came out, I knew on all my medical training, I could go lick doorknobs all day long. I was free. Whether or not they came out with a vaccine, I didn't think they would. I could care less. I had natural immunity. I got COVID 5 more times after that. So again, you got to look at the science, look at what we see as providers and, the tens of thousands of people we may come across in a career, and scratch your head and say, well, why doesn't that add up? Why do I not have natural immunity? Why did I get reactivation of mono or Epstein-Barr? Or why did I get shingles, reactivation of chicken pox? Like, that is not a normal state. If you have AIDS and you have no immune system, or your leukemia and you've had this bone marrow transplant, okay, that makes sense. But just because I'm 60s, I got shingles, just because I had COVID last week, and then I got it 3 days after I cleared the infection again. Like, that should not happen with our current understanding and model of viral replication, and specifically coronaviruses. Those are viruses well known to doctors. We talked about that before.
Yeah.
SARS-2 was a little, variation on the theme, but it should not have been like some novel virus that they dug out of an ice core from 20 million years ago that we're screwed because we've evolved so much away from it. And then the opportunistic with the terrain and the exposure and the stress creates a perfect storm that wipes out the human race. That's probably next week.
That's coming, I'm sure. Well, then that leads kind of to the simpler question of, was it even a vaccine? Because my understanding of vaccines was you're not supposed to get it after you get it.
Right.
But that didn't
changed.
happen.
That changed, didn't it?
It felt odd that people were still getting it. And maybe that's the simple question of, what was it? I don't know.
Well, and what causes disease? So if you get exposed to a vaccine, a dead virus, and you get all the symptoms of the illness itself, like Dr. Hart was saying, that's more consistent with that philosophy and understanding. And some, I always thought it was odd that every time I got mandated to have a flu vaccine because I worked in a hospital or whatever, I got the flu. Like 3 to 7 days, I felt like garbage. Did I ever get the flu without the vaccine? No. Now, I'm one person and I'm subjective, but I am 100% sure getting those vaccines made me sicker. And you could argue, well, it's supposed to provoke an immune response and maybe yours is a little overactive. Look at try to find independent data of large studies of these trials, and there are problems with many, if not all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, how do you even do a study like that as well? Like, to actually definitively prove some of this stuff when there's so many variables, it almost seems...
It's really tough. Like, so here's a problem with like a vaccine is it requires so many steps that they would have had to research probably 3 to 5 parts of a vaccine individually to understand, right? So what they're injecting you with typically, not COVID, but typically is a dead microbe, usually a dead virus, bacteria. So they need to research that. Then they need to research whatever they're going to inject you with to stimulate your immune system, aluminum, mercury, other adjuvants are called, right? You have to then also study the long-term response that, yes, now your immune system will react to our test, but will it actually stop the virus or bacteria or whatever? So that's another part of the research. And so they didn't. All they did was come up with the treatment and then inject some people with it and do a mild study to say, did it fix the blood test? We call it surrogate markers, right? We don't actually know if a lot of these vaccines work to stop the disease. All we know is they fixed the blood test we did. It's a surrogate test. It's not a true test. It's a surrogate. And so they didn't do that. They went ahead and tested the end product versus all the steps in between, which makes it difficult.
Yeah, and then that data, of course, gets so muddied up with, millions of paragraphs and phrases of, complex jargon to hide everything in a way that makes it less understandable, it seems. Same with like lawyer talk in a way where it's like, you can just add some filler and it's good. And then you trace it all the way back to like one paragraph and that was where it all came from. Some like weird stuff like that. Like that's what they were talking about with the OxyContin stuff. Like safe and effective was used once and then everything, it was used everywhere.
Yeah, became the catchphrase. There was a really incredible movement, if you look at American history, within the first 50 to 75 years of American history, where a couple of early medical doctors wanted to make medicine accessible for the average person. At the time, the average mom to be a pretty decent, basically home nurse, right? Stop using Latin because we didn't need to use it. Stop using Latin to define everything and make it more accessible. And the establishment, quote unquote, at the time, nixed that because using things like Latin to describe all the medical terms, which most people don't realize, like, hey, look, the diagnosis for itchy butt in Latin makes it seem like a real diagnosis, but all it means is itchy butt. And it doesn't tell you, like pruritus doesn't really tell you what's causative or what to do about it. All it tells you is you have an itchy butt. But if you say it in Latin, everybody's like, got it. I got that thing.
Yeah.
Right? And so
sounds way more official.
Yeah, we squashed that way back when that, like exactly what you're saying, like to use that jargon in the medical research, there's no point, right? There's no point, but there's not a point in the science, but there's a point to keep it inaccessible.
Just for that barrier.
Yeah, it's a really good point. The other thing that'll happen is, they'll discover or develop a new disease, name it after a dead white guy, and there's always a push to get it into the Latin. Which again is interesting. Like Greek, I kind of get Hippocrates and kind of our Western model, but I tell this patients every single day, like, oh well, I've got eczema, I've got urticaria, I've got gastroparesis. Like that's a symptom in Latin. That's not a diagnosis. Like, and also I'm gonna be like, well, geez, that sounds exhausting. You know what that means? And they're like, they have no clue. Why? Partially this, and partially the doctors don't want to explain squat. The Greek word for physician is teacher. Yet the last thing they want to do is teach because they don't fundamentally understand. We talked about that before. They're myopic. They're very algorithmic in their thinking. Let me draw a lab. Let me look at this reference value, and let me treat a number because there's a standard of care or medical, legal, defensive posture that you have to take. And that's just what you do. You don't think outside that box. You don't question that. That's just bad care. And that's why I mentioned brainwashed before. But certainly that dogma is easier to see when you see so many people fail to respond in the ways that the standard of care clearly says, oh, no, this works. This is what you do. This works on everybody. And the ones that don't, we know why. Couldn't be further from the truth. We wouldn't have so many of these medical refugees we talked about last time.
Well, it's getting scary, and it feels like even the standard of care has gone down in standard but up in price as well, which is, something that is painful to talk about for most. Like, you get nothing for, if you have to take your kid. We took CJ in, he got like a urine sample just because he was, I don't know, he was acting weird or something, lethargic and spitting up. And it was like $2,000 for a urine sample, and they didn't do anything.
Did you hear about the guy on the cruise ship? He got the flu on a cruise ship. Went to the clinic, and I think the bill was $67,000.
Yeah, it's like, what did they even do?
Supportive care.
Supportive care. That's like a terrifying thing to think about. That It wasn't even like, because there's not really anything they could have really done. He just had the flu. You just have
wait
to
it out.
Wait.
Yep.
And do doctors just prescribe things to keep their patients from thinking like, oh, he didn't help me at all?
Definitely an expectation that you've done something when we whip out the prescription pad. That's a big bias. The other thing is convenience and annoyance. So if I have 5 minutes because I'm seeing 60 people in urgent care, and I know when I walk in this, I'm not going to be able to educate the person that, hey, antibiotics don't affect viral illnesses or whatever. They just take it out. That's what you want. I know I'm not going to change your mind. I got 5 minutes and I'm freaking exhausted, want to get out of here. And I'll back shelve the understanding of what I'm treating, even though I may or may not know better. And I'll get you out of my office, basically, make you feel like you got something, you done something, harness the power of placebo, and let's just ignore the contribution to antibiotic resistance in the community, for instance. So it's a real good point, a real problem that I fight every day, but I just cannot give in to the dark side of not spending time with patients, not educating them, and not telling them like how many treatments and supportive interventions are available right at your fingertips. And some are old, castor oil and things like that go back, but there's still excellent treatments that are available.
Well, is it one of those things like nobody can patent that stuff and make money off of it and own the rights to it, so why would anybody want to promote any of that? Why would anybody want to promote silver water if nobody owns it?
Follow the money.
Yeah, the margin of profit's low on those sort of things, right? So like who's gonna pay the commercials? Who's gonna mass produce it? Because you can't make a ton of money.
Yeah, it's a scary world, and you guys weigh into it way harder than I have to, thankfully. I mean, I'm sure someday when I'm old and dying, I guess, at that point, I'll be wading into the medical world heavily. It seems like everybody's life ends with heavy medical intervention, which is...
We spend most of our monetary investment in healthcare is done in the last 6 months? Is that the research?
I think it was 3 months. Actually, it was 6 months.
Yeah,
it was 6 months.
Last 6 months of life is when we spend most of our medical dollars in the U.S. at least.
So to put the conspiracy hat on a little bit, is that also by design to extract the last amount of money out of somebody before they go, in a way? Like, is it by it seems like it's a great design. Like, why let inheritance go to anywhere but the medical industry? That would be
It's
crazy.
an interesting way to think of it, like, because the reality is we know, right? There's good data out there that shows what interventions are realistically going to work, provide quality of care. So, for instance, in end of life type interventions of like cancer, heart disease, we know the realistic outcomes of most of those interventions. And we can say, like, look, you're 65, 85, whatever, you've got stage 4 cancer, probably doing 10 months of chemo, you're going to feel terrible. It's not going to really extend your life by more than a couple months. We could reduce the amount of care we put that money, a fraction of that money into palliative care, like end of life, make you comfortable care so you can live your life, spend it with your family. And yeah, you might not live 2 years, you might live 18 months, but you're going to like those 18 months a whole lot better, and they're going to cost a fraction.
Well, actually, if you look at the studies, a lot of times people actually live longer in palliative medicine because they're getting better quality of care and more kind of common sense. And I think the other thing, like, none of us have Medicare. We're not eligible or old enough. But end of life usually involves Medicare. Now you're talking about government insurance. You're talking about socialized medicine. You're talking about a general lack of oversight in terms of oversight and as to what makes the most sense. And then the vision that, like you said, that they may not going to be around 3 or 6 months. So there's an end or an out to the financial piece. So I think a lot of that just gets poured on at the end because it's government medicine and they're thinking that they're not going to be around that long.
Yeah, it's a scary thought there at the end, because that's a lot of just everything starts to happen so quickly too. I feel like, where you get almost decision paralysis and people get convinced to do one thing. And I was just talking to someone and they're like, they got like an ear tumor thing, and the radiologist is like, you have to do radiation. The surgeon's like, you have to do surgery.
Yeah.
Neither of them will talk to each other.
Yeah,
But
it's another
both
problem.
of them are butting heads on what you have to do. And I was like, why don't you just do neither of them? You're 60 years old.
Yeah.
Or why don't you make an informed decision and do it yourself? Again, doctors aren't supposed to impart their personal, projection, their personal bias, their personal beliefs, religion. They're supposed to inform you to do the best care, explain informed consent, risk, benefits, alternatives, what's available, what's affordable. And to your point, they often make you feel, and we talk more about this with vaccines and kids, like you're a bad patient, like you're a bad person, like you're a bad parent. You get the 47 vaccines because that's just what you do. If they could really explain it to you, they might actually explain it to themselves that, hey, maybe I ought to question the status quo of my training and my thinking, especially COVID. I think we lost a lot of people. They saw how the pandemic was mismanaged and lost even more faith in the medical system.
In both directions, though.
Yeah.
You lost them to be full, this is my religion now. And then you lost them to like full anti-medical, which is
extremism.
both scary. Both are slightly scary to be, full, don't drive me past a hospital type of fear. It's also a worry.
There's probably a lot of people, COVID was the red pill, blue pill, and probably a lot of folks in that time had never been offered it. And so you're probably right. A lot of people are like, yeah, give me the red pill. Let's wake up to the matrix. And a lot more people were like, let me swallow that blue pill as hard as I can and shift all the way to the dogma, right? Like Albert Camus, the absurdist, he would say, he calls that philosophical suicide. Let me bury my head in the dogmatic sand to try to escape the reality I have to think too much. And I think a lot of people did that. They swallowed the blue pill and said, let me go in almost religiously, like you said, and just put my head in the sand and not have to think any harder about it.
Yeah, and you can't undo like your vaccine. So you kind of have to stand on it a little bit at that point and like hope and convince yourself that this was the right move.
Yes.
Whether it was or not for you, it's not really for me to say.
Yeah.
Well, and it was a new intervention during a crisis with pressure, and there's a social psychology piece to this. We talked about when any person or society stresses, they regress. to more primitive coping skills. And if that's daddy protect me, and daddy is doctor, daddy is government, daddy is big pharma, they hand that power very quickly over, especially when they're scared. I mean, we did that in 9/11 and for different reasons, but that was the medical equivalent of it. And then doubling down. Like if I can just get 6 boosters, I'm going to be extra protected. Never is it appropriate or okay to discuss what does each booster do? What is each vaccine doing in your body with your health, your DNA, your illness, your exposures? You know, if you're elderly in a nursing home, that's very different than being born in a third world country where we've got seriously deadly outbreaks and poor access to care, where maybe a vaccine could make more sense to ride it out on a bike and save a little kid from polio. That wasn't even a conversation. We just, not only was that not in the forefront, you were chastised and threatened for even asking and ridiculed. That's not science. That's not medicine at any point. I get there's a little leeway during a pandemic when people are scared and binary and they're thinking in black and white. But we didn't learn anything. We're still here doing the same thing, expecting different results.
Yeah, I mean, we'd go down that almost immediately again. It feels like forgot everything from 2020, probably purposely. I mean, traumatic events tend to blank out of people's minds. I mean, people forget 9/11, they forget the Challenger stuff. Like, they just, like, if you saw it, you kind of try to blank it out, like you didn't see it.
It was a trauma, for sure.
It's weird. It's going to be weird, the next thing that inevitably happens, because it's going to happen again, right? It's like guaranteed that some virus or some bacteria or something, I don't know.
Mad cow.
Again, Mad Cow 2.
Crazy bird.
The sequel.
Even we talked about Lyme disease, and that's a scary one for me. I grew up in the Northeast. I grew up, I don't know, 10 miles from Plum Island, where it all started. Yeah. And it damaged many, many people that I know. And there's still so little known about that. It's just like, there's some people that are like, yeah, I can't eat red meat anymore.
Yeah.
And it's like, do you know anything more why? And it's like...
Are you questioning it any farther than that? Yeah.
Yeah, and they're just kind of like, this is life now. And I'm like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy to me that's just like a tick, and then it doesn't make much sense. And I know you talked about it a little bit before we started, because I don't know. I mean, is it spreading across the country more?
It's way more prevalent now. And it's so in American research, North American research, we know it's in all 50 states now. Okay. And I mean, even with the last 10 years in my practice, I would have patients who said, my medical doctor said it's not in Oklahoma. Because what? Ticks can't magically cross state lines? Like, they're like, oh, let me show the highway patrol my ID. Like, no, right? And so now we know research-wise, it's in all 50 states. It's worldwide, though. There's European strains we have. Australia just started recognizing. They weren't recognizing it. Even if they had a positive test in Australia, they weren't recognizing it. Now they're recognizing it. They're seeing it, right? So it's not only do we know it's in all 50 states, but at this point we know it's worldwide. We know we have Central American variations. We know of European variations. We know it's in Australia. And in fact, I was actually discussing this. We were discussing this today with a patient's father, that because he felt like, well, the normal testing isn't finding it, right? Like the medical testing isn't finding it. And my rebuttal to that partially was this Quest Labs, who's one of the biggest labs in North America, had to file a complaint against the CDC because the CDC was purposely suppressing the amount of positive Lyme tests that Quest was reporting by at least 50% for years. Quest Labs was saying, look, it's not even a good test. It's a bad test they run. It's a poor accuracy. And they were saying the CDC was suppressing the results by at least 50%.
Why would the CDC do such a thing? Who would have thought that they were nefarious?
It was probably an accident for years.
Crazy, yeah. Oh, man. So they're out here fudging numbers on purpose, very 1984-like, having a ministry of truth.
Yeah.
And Quest Labs, were they putting this out themselves, or were they not allowed to? Like, could they publish their own third-party stuff, or was it highly regulated by, like the Hippocratic Oath, I guess, or whatever?
Typically, those labs won't. They'll publish the data, but they won't put it out like as a public release, right? Like we got this many staph infections, we got this many, right? You can find that data, but it's not like in a news release, right? But because what the CDC was reporting versus how many positives they were coming up with, they were seeing the discrepancy over years. And so at that point, they wrote a letter to CDC and then went ahead when the CDC just said, we're not doing anything about this. They published that data.
Why do you think the CDC would try to not publish it? What's their reasoning? What would be a possible even reasoning to not?
I have some thoughts on that one.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say.
There's a motive for everything.
Well, we talked about the American Dental Association, the FDA, and kind of how they've looked at mercury and even doubled down fairly recently to say definitively, like, this does not cause illness, which we know is 100% wrong. So I think that there is a certain amount of protection of the medical system, the government, the financial, because if they know mercury is toxic, for instance, but if they go out and say, hey, we were wrong, this stuff's toxic, you've got 200 million people out there that are going to sue every dentist and government and bankrupt the country. That doesn't mean that there's not an active campaign to reduce and remove that and phase it out. And I think the same type of thing happened during COVID. It was like, oh, wait a minute, all of a sudden there's no more flu infections. It's all COVID now. And so I'm
great
careful.
Year it dropped.
Yeah, like
100%.
I'm careful to impute scientific research, but the interpretation of it is where the rubber hits the road. Like having reviewed so many scientific articles over my life, I can tear apart every single one of them. Any good scientist should be able to tell you, what are the weaknesses in the study? What are the holes? What's correlation causality? Like what's test retest variability and reliability? They always are subject to really heavy scrutiny, and it's not just what happens in the real world is you publish a study like, oh, a glass of wine a day lowers heart disease. It's good for you. People believe that crap to this day, even though there's thousands of studies that directly say the opposite. So there's bias for humans, there's bias in interpretation, there's bias in public consumption, there's bias in research design, there's bias in follow the money. So I think there's a lot of reasons why the CDC wouldn't want mass hysteria, especially during a pandemic, or a massive financial litigation structural problem with like the amalgam illness that's out there contributing, exacerbating, and flat out causing so many diseases.
So they're just more protectionist of lawsuits and litigation. That's the gist of that. It's just
that's what a part
potentially.
Of
Well, I think, if you go back to even the Plum Island concept, right, is like, what is Plum Island? It's a Department of Defense, Department of Justice research lab, right? And so what we know, what's right outside of Plum Island is Lyme, Connecticut, right, where we first discovered Lyme disease, Borrelia burgdorferi, as to point of like you dead white guy, right?
Burgdorfer.
Yeah, William Burgdorfer, right, was a guy who found Lyme disease, and they added Dorferi on it to make it Latinish, but his name was William Burgdorfer. He was a medical doctor and research scientist who worked on Plum Island and then semi-retired to Lyme, Connecticut to be a small town family doctor. All these kids started getting weird, arthritic, massive problems. They got Lyme disease. He figured out. But what did he confess to on his deathbed? I developed this bacteria on Plum Island.
So, of course, he was able to identify quickly what he was seeing was what he developed. I mean, it's like returning to the scene of a crime pretty much. Like, of course, he had all the insight. I mean, at least he was nice enough to expose it.
Yeah.
But once that's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. It's Pandora's box type of thing. Like, you can't get it back in. Like, ticks are... If anybody's from the Northeast, I know particularly just ticks are one of those weird things. You think about them and you start itching. 'Cause, like, they're just crazy. Like, I've seen them, like, on the dash of a car ready to jump onto me. Like, it's like, how did you get here about to jump onto... And it's like the best animal of all time to spread something realistically.
It's a great weapon.
incredible.
It's a great weapon, for sure. And I think it's a lot of science and government have always had this weird relationship. Like someone will invent a technology, and their application is, like nuclear technology. We talked about that last time. Nuclear technology absolutely could be used, for energy production, or it can be used for mass destruction. So same type of thing. And this is the argument with the gain of function lab stuff, right? In Wuhan. Like, why are we even researching this? Most people don't have the slightest clue. The deadliest crap on planet Earth we keep locked up and study in CDC. And sometimes it gets out. Mm-hmm. It has. There's been multiple cases of it. Wuhan probably being one of them, whether that was intentional or unintentional. I don't really have a strong fall down on that. But the end's still the same. And so they got weaponized.
Mm-hmm.
Like those ticks.
Outbreaks. But just outbreaks in general, like from a research lab, like it's pretty common that they just slip out.
Yeah, or infect, it doesn't, the safety protocols and systems, we try to inspect these internationally, but it's just like International Atomic Energy. It's like Iran's like, yeah, no, you can't come in here or whatever. Yeah. Then you don't actually know what's really going on. And that's if you have a third party or somewhat objective person looking at this. And a lot of this is self-regulated too, or secret. So, I think he also admitted later in his life that they dropped a lot of these out of the sky.
Oh, yeah.
Which surprised a lot of people.
The ticks.
So is Lyme's disease like a virus then, or is that still kind of contention? Is it a bacteria? Is it a parasite?
The best we can call it at this point, Borrelia burgdorferi, the bacteria causes Lyme. There's a couple others that are associated with different types of Borrelia, but Borrelia burgdorferi is most likely genetically modified spirochetal. Basically, it's got a tail with a spiral bacteria.
Like a corkscrew.
Yes.
It looks like.
And would you call that a living organism then?
It does. It is alive, yeah.
So it is alive in the body, and we don't know how to actually kill it in the body without...
We've got means, it's just very difficult, and it's and this is where the probability of it being maybe genetically modified is important. It's way more strategic or counter-strategic to our attempts at killing it than almost any other infection, a bacterial infection, right? So it can it can what we call antigenically shift. So the little proteins on its shell that we would use our immune system or antibiotics to identify it and kill it, it can change those as it needs to. It's like a bank robber changing its clothes as soon as it robs the bank. So it hits an area, as soon as the immune system shows up, it's shifting, so now we have a hard time finding it. Not only do we have a hard time finding it to kill it, we have a hard time finding it to get a positive test, right? So because it shifted, your immune system was responding to the last antigenic shift, the last proteins, it's changed clothes, it's looking for the old one, which isn't there, so it stops responding. And it's now the new one is running rampant, and we can't respond to it because we couldn't find it. It's like being infected with a whole new infection all over again. And that's just one example of the systems that we know. This is research-based, that we know Lyme, Borrelia burgdorferi can do.
So it's a fairly impressive thing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a beauty to it, right? Objectively, there's a beauty to it.
Well, it's like when I see a hurricane, I'm like, it's like beautiful to see, and it's cool because it's like, wow, like look at what this is producing, but it's also like, man, people are gonna die.
It's like mushroom clouds. They've always made me hungry for some reason.
That might be a little sick in itself.
Fungus among us.
What kind of food?
They're patient too. So spirochetes can hang out, lay dormant for a while, and then like we talked, this could be an opportunistic infection. There's a stress on the body. Maybe you get the flu or COVID, and now all of a sudden, long haul COVID, which I'm surprised the Western world recognizes at all, especially as fast as they did. Like they were admitting long haul COVID within that first year, because it probably started here, at least in this part of the country, in October, I would say. I was seeing cases in October, and I think March or April was when they finally were like, oh, we got COVID in this country.
And that was, you're talking 2020, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
early on, recognizing that it was.
Well, that would be 2019.
Yeah,
October.
2019.
Yeah.
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 I mean, it's called COVID-19. Don't forget.
Yeah.
That is true. I didn't know if that was. I know it was the year 19. I don't know how they attached the 19 exactly to it.
Yeah,
I think it
to
was
the-
they claimed Chinese identified it in December.
Right.
But I'm sure that they knew well about it for years, possibly.
Even that confused me because they're like, it mutated, but they never changed what you call it. Wouldn't you call it something different if it is something different? Or is it similar enough to call it the same thing?
Remember, they were also talking about the variants, so the whole recombination variants of the Delta and the Omicron and all of that. But it is a highly mutatable virus. I mean, like I said, I had 3 people, myself and my family, infected at the same time. So that's why I think it wasn't a reactivation. We all had the normal, like, week, whatever, 5-10 day course. And we all got better at the same time. But then we all 3 got sick again with what looked and acted like a new infection just 3 days later. Everything I was taught literally says that's impossible. With one person, but that's a sample of 3, and it was probably a different strain, and there wasn't that cross reactivity. So that makes you think about, okay, how effective was this virus? Yes, the vaccine, it was untested. It was an mRNA, which is some newer technology delivered on that scale. There was already virus being exposed to pretty much everyone on the planet. So how much at that point was the vaccine gonna really affect global populations if it worked flawlessly, which now hindsight's 2020, there are still people out there that are like, it's time for my booster, and they will get a COVID shot every year, just like they'll get a flu shot every year until they die. What I worry about is they're going to die sooner. These are the ones that dropped out of the strokes and the heart attacks, and you're like, what? They had no health problems. They're 35 years old.
Well, have you seen an increase in that kind of stuff too? The blood
All
clots,
the
the health
time.
problems, the.
All the time. Still, all the time. I probably lost 2 patients this week that 100% were complications, in my medical opinion, of COVID infection, whether that was vaccine or the virus itself, because of the long-term changes it can cause in our biology.
And will the CDC say anything about this at all? Ever come out with anything? Ever?
I wouldn't bet on that one.
No, not beyond the couple of percent of normal immune response, the normal side effect response. Like, oh, we can expect this from a new medical treatment. They're not going to say the real numbers, though, right? Or the reality of the real deaths. What we had in our office, a gal came in. She had stroked out within days of getting the vaccination, right? Recovered, tried to go back to work, couldn't go back to work, couldn't do numbers. She was an accountant, couldn't do numbers right. She would say, I know these numbers aren't right, but I don't know why. I know the math doesn't add up. Couldn't talk, slow, sluggish, right? Came in. Now, here's what the funny part. She's hilarious. She's a great gal. She's got COVID 7 times. She's like, I got my 2 shots. I stroked out. It ruined my life. And I've gotten COVID 7 times. And so now we've done great work with her. She's almost totally recovered. Her personality's back. She's in the gym. She's working out 5 days a week. She can drive herself. She can do, she can't do full accounting, but she can do her bills, her family's bills now, that sort of thing. And that's with a lot of work, right? But for her, she's a case who, she had a definite reaction, changed her life, and she still got COVID 7 times.
That's crazy. That's huge fear, of course, for everyone, I'd imagine, is you try to do what you are told is right for society, and it bites you in the ass, and then society just, too bad.
Yep.
Yeah.
Figure it out from there.
It's tragic. I wish I could think of a word stronger than tragic, because this is affecting people's life. It's a life and death matter.
Yeah.
And it's hard to unsee it when you see it. And I think a lot more practitioners, even a lot of the allopaths, suspect it, wonder about it. Maybe I'm not going to encourage this, but they're under their own pressure from the managed care establishment that they work for, and benchmarks like we talked about before, and remuneration schedules with insurance, and standard of care, and medical liability. And by the way, the sovereign immunity that you got, these vaccine companies too. So if you're, from the doctor's perspective, even if they know better, they're still forced to do things knowing maybe it won't come back or be connected, or the people who are going to support me are going to be my colleagues, my AMA, my government, the big pharma that has this power against, basically anyone questioning vaccine outcomes.
So to not be as maybe doom and gloom, what would you tell somebody that did get the vaccine then? Maybe I got it 2 years ago and I'm fine, but
your days are numbered.
I'm fine right now.
Oh, not doom and gloom.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, you can be doom and gloom.
mean,
I just, I have to go run a marathon now. It's like, those kind of things where it's like, well, then it might hit you.
Yeah, I think there's two main pathways that I talk to these folks about. Like, first of all, I'm like, look, I don't judge you, because I realize it wasn't about the science for these people. Because if somebody questioned the science, that's one of their top values, and they would make their own critical reasoning decision. For these people who decided to go ahead and get vaccinated, I'd say, let's talk about your values. That's number one. What should we do now? Let's talk about your values. Conformity was probably a big value for you. It's probably one of your top values, right? So for me, autonomy is one of my top values. You tell me to do anything, I'm probably going to do the opposite, right? And then health is somewhere in there too, but that's a big one. So let's have a values talk to figure out what are your top values so we don't make these same mistakes again that are based on conformity or groupthink. And then, because we want that to be your next thing, what are you choosing? And then if you're going to choose health, I want to know why you're choosing health. What are your values for choosing it? And then from there, we can say, let's create a detox plan, help you detox this out. Let's create a plan that helps optimize your genetics, right? You've affected your cells. What do mRNA do? They tell your cells to make an inflammatory danger signal so that your immune system will attack your own cells. So we need to put a protocol together. Let's detox the junk out that was in it. Let's rewire your immune system again, right? Let's help your immune system calm down so it doesn't know to attack itself, right? And then let's get some cellular repair happening.
And that's
So
a lot of what we do.
But there is a way out-ish.
Yeah.
You're not trapped in the decision you made in 2020. There's a way to try to move forward with, actually being precautionary and doing some steps to not just be stuck in the decision. I mean, some people may have been walking into work that day and they're like, well, you either walk through the door or you're fired.
Right.
And then it's like, you're not even conforming at that point. You're just like, I got a family to feed.
Trying to survive.
Like that kind of person, where it's like they were forced into this. And that person, that I feel for, because most people in that situation would have been like, sure, okay, I guess so.
Got to do it. Stop digging the hole. Yeah, that's the phrase. Stop digging the hole. Don't be the guy getting six, right? Like, stop digging the hole.
Set the shovel down. I mean, we know that we're improving outcomes with various detox and support mechanisms that he talked about. What we don't know is by how much and for how long. And I don't think anyone can really predict that. In other words, like, if we do a medical adventure to undo, we don't know if that relative risk goes back to what it was before you'd been exposed to the virus or the vaccine. Right. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows that. Time will tell. And I had hoped and had fully expected that these people that have been dropping dead so obviously to everybody would have had a somewhat of more of a short time limit. And unfortunately, I was wrong about that. We continue to see these unexplained hypercoagulable, bizarre outcomes in epidemiological profile of people that should not happen at the rates that they're having. What's frustrating is, why hasn't the medical establishment or community picked up on that yet? Because there's tons of mechanisms to make sure that basically that never comes out. I mean, we just recently got JFK files released, right? So I think
it was only 60 years, 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible in 50 or 100 years they could be like, yeah, that was totally botched.
Yeah,
this is what really happened. But for now, we do the best we can. I am very confident we're moving the needle on returning them to a more optimal original pre-morbid state of health. But I truly don't know how much. Is it as good as before? Or are they going to have a heart attack in 10 years or a stroke in 10 years now when it would have been 2 before? Did we kick the can? Either way, you
sound like you're saying this is like 100% though, which is a scary thought. Like,
If it's 100%, if you have end organ damage, and if that's COVID toe, that's a heck of a lot different than I die before I finish this sentence.
Yeah.
it just sounds like more dire than I guess I thought of it.
Well, why don't you pick him up some? I'm a little doom and gloom.
So, well,
I never got the vaccine, and Bronte and me had a very long, struggling conversation with it, and thankfully she got pregnant not long after, which was a big fear of mine when it first started to kind of unravel. And I told her, I was like, I'm not getting it.
Yeah, I hope you catch that guy, by the way. What, you wanted less doom and gloom?
That's a bad joke.
But yeah, that was our fear. Of course, the pregnancy stuff was a big fear at the time. I heard crazy things about pregnancy and how it was reacting with them.
Yeah.
Horrible, because pregnancy already is a hypercoagulable state.
Yeah.
So travel, birth control, smoking, and then an inflammatory state. That's a perfect storm. And that's why you're seeing people run down the basketball court and dying before they hit the pavement.
Yeah, but then there's so many people that maybe it's just that's probably all anecdotal that are just fine that got it.
Yes.
But that's all anecdotal.
Well, no. I mean, I've directly had people and I ask every person, did you get the vaccine? Did you not get the vaccine? How did you react? How did you respond? I'm not in a strong agenda. Every person, every case, every situation is unique and different. But I think it's curious. It's great that they didn't have any symptoms that they are aware of or able to report, or maybe it didn't even cause anything. What I would say, and tell me if you saw the same thing, is people who got the virus or the vaccine and had a strong immunologic response tended to do worse, with the exception of kids. They're not little adults. They tended to have a worse post-illness course and more likely to get long-haul COVID. In other words, if you got a vaccine and you didn't get any side effects except a sore site injection, which is you could get if you injected saline, that corresponded to a better outcome. So I was less worried about them. Now, that being said, I'd still, check and follow some of the measures that I do to try to assess that, because it could be a silent killer like heart disease itself.
Well, the hard part is we didn't, for a lot of these people who did fine, we don't have good pre and post measures to all these people, right? We didn't look at, so some of the lab markers we didn't have D-dimers pre and post the vaccine. Yeah. We didn't have ESR. We didn't have CRP. We didn't have, prothrombin time. So maybe their markers worsened by 10%, and it wasn't enough to give them an event. But the reality is 20 years down the road, they're more likely to have a heart attack or a stroke. But we don't know, and it's so far out from the intervention that how can we put it, right? So we don't have, unfortunately, the good data to track that. That's the reality. And a lot of people don't grasp it. Like, well, I didn't react 2 days later. Well, yeah, you weren't so sensitive. Your tipping point took 20 years to tip in, right? But if we could track it, so there's an interesting phenomenon, which I'm careful of patient data, and so I'm not sure where I truly stand, but it would be interesting for us as a healthcare community to function a little bit to the data collection we can do. So if you have somebody who gets a physical every year and does blood work, you can do a certain line of blood work and start tracking that every year, and there's a statistical deviation, right? So if you're prothrombin time, which means how quickly you clot, right? And so if it suddenly clots much faster, if it goes up 20%, and the only thing you did different this year was got 2 COVID vaccines, that's going to be a bigger factor later on for how you do. Even if it doesn't give you an event in that year, we could track that, but we're not doing that, right? So it's even a hard line to say for some, jabroni to be like, yeah, I did fine. And you're like, that's great, bro, but we don't actually know if you did fine.
Yeah.
You could feel the same if I punched you in the face and you drank a fifth of Jack. Who knows, right? And so we just don't, unfortunately, have the good data on those folks to really even say now, and then there's going to be almost an impossibility to track it unless there's a massive uptick in 20 years. It's going to be really difficult to track it to the interventions we did now.
That's exactly what I think. The only other thing I would add to that is what the difference in the intervention between the virus and the vaccine was. In other words, the virus itself may cause a similar, let's say that 10% reduction. But if you don't have 10% reserve, now you're manifesting illness or even symptoms. But you could not get away from this virus if you lived on planet Earth. We think over 99%, and that's a conservative estimate, of people got exposed to that thing. That's insane.
Yeah, there was people in like the Arctic Circle that were like, "Oh, the whole camp is down with COVID," and it's like, what?
It's like the forever chemicals. Like,
How'd this get here?
how in the world does this Aborigine tribe have this crap in their blood?
Yeah, well, they were just talking about the amount of plastic in our body, and it's like, well, there's nothing I can do about that.
Microplastics.
It's stuck in me. They're like, you
Every
have
pair
a
of
spoon in your
testicles
brain,
in
and
the
I'm
US.
like,
yeah, every pair of testicles has plastic in it.
that's crazy.
Not mine. I keep them shrink wrapped. So.
With plastic.
Yeah, it keeps the plastic out.
I was born with 3, so.
But again, I mean, that's all petroleum-based stuff that's just in us.
Yeah.
And it's just, we just got it.
And that weakens our terrain, which makes the vulnerability for infection or reactivation. I think why we're seeing overlaid with electromagnetic effects and ultra-processed food, why we are seeing so many sick humans, especially in this country. And especially kids. Like, that's a big, we hear it a lot, but like, kids never got sick when our parents or their parents, like, if they did, it was scarlet fever, rheumatic fever, or some sort of birth defect, or maybe the Down syndrome. It wasn't, every kid's on an asthma medicine and gets rashes and this little portly thing, and his headaches and tummy aches and all of the hyper ADHD. We talked about that last time.
That's the one that scares me too. Is the you see some chunky kids out there, and it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
It's all right. Like, mine's a baby. He's 18 months old or 13 months old. Like, that's a little different than seeing like a 5-year-old walking around carrying an extra 40 pounds, and it's like,
or a 12-year-old with diabetes, which is scarily shot up like 20, 25 fold
I
or
was
something.
say way more common than you think.
Yeah.
that kind of stuff is just terrifying, because it's like that's like the people. That's us. Like, that's the country right there, and
That's
it's
our
just
future.
it's sad to see.
And who's coming to rescue us from ourselves? Who's coming to give us unbiased, objective, helpful information, especially in the age of digital technology and social media and algorithms and AI and stuff like that? We're getting more and more selective about how we consume, and unconsciously, like we were talking about before the show, this transhumanism being fed into a system to keep you locked down, keep you from questioning, or keep you in the line of thinking that you believe, whether that's flat earth or interdimensional beings or conspiracy stuff, whatever, so that you further that narrative and agenda. I think ultimately to push product and for advertising, but certainly I'm not closed-minded to all the other nefarious things. I'm just trying to tone down the doom and gloom here.
No, I mean, I'm fine with that. I just, the COVID stuff for the people that are like have the vaccine was my worry, because telling them that it's like, you're screwed, bud, man. Like, buy the casket.
Let's put a nice bow on that, right? So, and with the clientele and patients we work with, if we're helping them along with a vaccine injury, let's say with this, is like, look, let's look at the lab markers that we know we can track, that we know the vaccine causes. Let's do some interventions and let's recheck. We get results with it, right? Like the gal we were talking about, stroked out, whatever, she's doing incredible. She's living a life. She's laughing. She's active. She's fit. She's like, right. And so there's interventions now that we see that work. We can track it through data. We can track it through subjective tones. And so you need to find a practitioner who's going to say, let's look at what's happening to you, right? You're blood clotting too much. Let's work on that. You're in a cell danger response due to the downregulation of your mitochondria of the vaccine. There's things we can do. Let's see if they improve you. There's things we can measure. There's interventions we can do, and then we can remeasure and say, are we on the right track or are we not? And then we need to pivot. And we get results, right? Those people. So, like, am I saying that they're going to be as good of or better than before? I don't know, but I'm seeing they can improve from where they're at significantly.
Yeah. Well, some people are in such a negative state to begin with that you can improve by just diet, exercise, changing lifestyle. That the
fundamentals.
Sure, you got the COVID vaccine and maybe that took another 10% off you, but you're already 40% down from where you should be.
Yeah.
Just as like a level 0, if you're talking about it like that. Like, you're already, let's get you to like as close to just the vaccine as we can seems like a good start for most people.
Yeah, 100%.
And yeah, it's a scary one, and it's a real one. I appreciate you guys being so open about that stuff, because I feel like it's still taboo in a way on that. But to talk about some more controversial stuff that I don't think you hear enough of is 5G.
Yeah.
Mark told me you were pretty heavily researched and into that side of things, and I don't hear it much, and I feel like I try to pay attention to things like that.
Yeah.
What are we all missing here?
So here's what's interesting, right? As a segue from what you're talking about into 5G, for the first 18 months especially, if you tracked COVID deaths along with 5G, because that's when 5G was getting rolled out, right? It was 2019, 2020. And so if you track that first 18 months of COVID deaths with 5G rollout, the areas had the most 5G had the most deaths, right, per capita. And that does not influenced by population numbers. What I mean by that is saying, you could say, well, big cities are going to have the most 5G, they're going to have the most deaths because they're big cities, right? No. If a small town had 5G rolled out, they had more deaths than the same size small town next to them who didn't have 5G, right? And I can't say it's causative. All we know is that those two things correlate. Those data's track. So Wuhan was originally rolled out as if it were some pig farming town with a bunch of wet markets and shacks, shanties.
They sell bats at the farmer's market.
Yes, right. You think it's some backwoods from 300 years ago. No. Super technology advanced, probably more on average technology advanced than most U.S. cities, right? Way more 5G. One of the earliest adopter of 5Gs, way more 5G towers at the time than almost our entire country. Wuhan had, right? So the idea that it had, and then when they had their second surge of deaths, they knocked out their second generation, their second load of 5G. They spiked perfectly with their unveiling. Within a month of each bump, first wave of deaths, next one, second wave of deaths, right? So that's a big issue that we're not thinking about. And then second with 5G is that it's in a bandwidth, meaning a set of frequencies that we know is directly influential on our physiology. Whereas a lot of cell towers and stuff, like otherwise, they do have some effect, but it's harder to measure, okay? The bandwidth of 5G, meaning the amount of frequencies within 5G, is so large comparatively and so much more potent that we know it has a physiological effect, right? And so that's a big problem for us in that setup, that we already know this is an issue, right? But we're unveiling it anyways in a bigger bandwidth, in a higher density.
And it was known for a period of time that hitting somebody with this different frequencies isn't good.
Right.
Already known.
We know it has health consequences beforehand. And the hard part is 5G, because it's so potent, it can't travel as far, right? It's a bigger frequency, but it can't travel as long of a distance.
Yeah, it's not like a radio wave where it's like super long
Yes,
wave.
exactly.
Or even the 2.4G can travel through objects better, so solid walls, and the decay of that signal is less per the distance. And so I think before the explanation or the consensus was, well, that's true, but only if you live on top of the tower. It's like a microwave. We have microwaves going through us all the time, but go lay on a big satellite dish, a microwave dish, it's gonna cook your organs. You'll feel it. I've done it. So I think we underestimated how close you have to be, and it turns out some people can be further away and get sick first. And maybe it's the death by 1,000 cuts, the 10%. I was always fascinated with people that moved way out in the electromagnetic void out west,
the boonies.
and they did better. Now you could say, well, that's totally because they're psychotic or placebo or whatever. I believe they had a physiologic setup that additional load was tipping them into serious illness. And then last time we talked about how it can accelerate the breakdown of amalgams. So is the 5G causing that, or is the 5G disrupting your physiology in other ways, like implants interfering with? If you cook microwave, different organs heat up at different rates. If you have implants, they might be immune. If they're plastic or metal, it might spark inside of you, that kind of thing.
You got like a metal shoulder or hip, titanium in you, I would imagine that's probably...
And your
nicely attracting
vulnerabilities,
things.
you know, whether you're a child may affect you worse, or you're elderly, it may affect you worse. And we really only study middle-aged men.
But what is it? What is it is actually doing? So is it like a microwave where it's heating up the water molecules in you? Because
No, we've seen that that's not quite the factor, right? I mean, it's not that there's not that effect. It's just not substantial enough to cause probably disease. So there's a couple of research factors that we know for sure reliably happen, right? With 5G and strong electromagnetic fields. The biggest one is it causes a ton of free radicals. It causes damage to our cells. Basically, it causes our cells to create way more garbage. It's like it's all the landfills on the earth filling up too fast, right? That happens inside of our cells. They create way more antioxidants. Secondarily, it causes what we call a glutamate cascade. So glutamate's a neurotransmitter that makes us fire, right? If you're awake, we're talking, what's getting these nerves in my brain to talk to you right now is glutamate. They're saying, boop, 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 go. But what EMFs do, we can see this reliably, is they ram those doors open, allow glutamate to spill out all over the place, which is excitotoxic. That's why MSG, monosodium glutamate, causes headaches and issues, is because of the extra excitotoxicity. And so it rams those open in our brain. When those get rammed open, there's too much. They also go on to create further cell death, which then spills more glutamate, right? So we know EMFs do that. 5G especially, because it goes shorter, like we were saying, so you need more towers. You need more receptors, which creates way more voltage. 5G in and of itself creates a massive amount of more voltage for our body to have to deal with that we're unaccustomed to. So that means more free radicals, more cell death, more glutamate, more excitotoxicity that's not there. And that's all the effects after that, right? So we know it suppresses sleep. We know it suppresses melatonin production. We know it interferes with hormone production in children, right? All of these factors, growth hormone, that it interferes with, that we're not even thinking about because we're not measuring directly. Well, we are in research, but an average doctor is not measuring in his clinic to know that this is EMF, this is 5G.
And the other thing, the argument against this, and always the go-to scapegoat is, well, this is not an ionizing radiation. So you have ionizing and non-ionizing. Ionizing radiation, and we've known really since World War II, it goes in and it just starts cutting DNA, like just whacks it and pretty much irradiates you from the outside. And then if it's non-ionizing, it's completely safe. And that's an old argument, and it's very, very, again, myopic. It doesn't tell you how electromagnetic fields, 5G, microwave, anything is affecting in other ways that are not, nicking DNA, like cosmic radiation or nuclear, fallout, radioactive stuff. But what's creepier is in Chernobyl, which was not that long ago. I remember when that happened when I was a kid. They said, hey, this is ionizing radiation. It's an exclusion zone. Everything's going to die and get cancer. And quite the opposite has happened. It seems to have reactivated dormant genes that are probably from our ancestors from either previous civilizations long forgotten or cosmic events or something like that. As far as we know or even infer, nothing like this has ever happened on Earth before. That's scarier to me. In other words, it will take our biology infinitely longer to adapt to this type of immersion in technology in this way. And even if we knew it, would we do anything about it? Could we do anything about it?
If we knew for a fact, every person knew that the 5G tower was negatively impacting them, could we do anything about it?
We're going to do 10G, and then we're going to do 20G, and then we're going to do 40G, and then we may realize, whoops, we were wrong. What do we do then?
I mean, any rational person would, if you step back and think, man, all these waves just bombarding me all day can't be good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, you don't have to really have much knowledge on how it all works to know, like, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. There being, like, waves that are just bombarding me all day and I can't get away from them.
No.
It has to do something. It has to. It just, what it does, that's a whole nother.
Well, then you kind of do have to ask and get a little bit conspiracy theorist of, like, what's the point of it? Which is interesting to think about with 5G, right? What does 5G offer us but higher interconnectability, right, between technology venues, which gives us what we're leading into, which is the Internet of Things, right? We don't need 5G. We don't realistically need faster service than 4G. We don't. Like, we've got enough cell towers, satellites, whatever. We could have 4G wherever we want it. We don't really need, nobody's like begging for faster 4G. right? And if you're at home, you've got fiber and whatever. But what 5G offers is the Internet of Things. It means your TV can be connected to your dishwasher, can be connected to your phone, can be connected to your power company, right? All those things can be connected, synchronized. You can connect it to your Apple Watch so you can control who's at your front door. Oh, grandma's coming, let me turn up the AC. Let me make sure the drinks are fridged out, right? We can connect that. Why is that beneficial? There's a cool concept, right? Like I just said, that's cool. Make sure the house is cooler for grandma. We can see she's coming because we're tracking her in the car, right? On our Apple Watch or whatever. There's a second aspect though of control where all that's hooked up to somebody else. And are you complying with whoever's controlling all of that? Because what that means then is now everybody can, whoever's controlling the power, the internet, the data to your home controls all of it.
Yeah, and the faster they can move data from you to them, the more control they have. I mean, if there's less latency in how quickly your data from your car and all the cameras goes, because it's a lot of data moving.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So you would need that as quick as possible if you're trying to get it from, I don't know, 450 million Americans, I guess you could say.
Exactly. You need it. Yeah. Right.
You need it quickly.
Yes. And you could even argue, because now our cars hook up, right, to that setup. So how are you driving? How were you driving at that point? Do you end up, what we're moving towards a social credit system, right? So everything you're doing is now monitored, right? Were you going the speed limit? Did you use too much electrical bill this much? Did you use too much water?
Yeah.
Right? And it's a concept maybe some people don't grasp, like especially maybe like where I'm from Tennessee, there's not a lot of oversight like that. But if you're from Colorado, you better believe the utility company is measuring every ounce of water you're using and billing you for it. And that could be construed much differently when everything you're doing is being monitored, tracked, data, interconnected, and controllable at that point.
Including a self-driving car.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah.
I mean, a car that, it happened in when that Cybertruck had the explosion in the bed of the truck at Trump Tower. One of my first things was like, man, they had the data from that thing quick.
Oh yeah.
Like almost immediately they were like, oh no, it wasn't the Cybertruck, there was an external explosion. I'm like, they were like, we saw all the data, and I'm like, that feels a little. Yeah. I was like, okay, it seems a little fast to have the data, but okay, I guess that's how it works. It was just really quick.
Yeah.
They had the in-car footage, the external car footage quickly.
Yeah. Oh yeah, what's hard is too, like you can see in books and movies, where maybe is this heading, right? Like I read a book years ago about the presidency, and somebody had injected the president and his staff with nanobots and basically were blackmailing him because anywhere he went near a cell tower, they could kill him through the nanobots, right? They could send a message in, and you're like, is that where we're headed? And maybe not that extreme, but are you doing the wrong things? We locked your car down. We locked your bank account down. You actually can't get in your house, right? Until you comply, until you do what we ask. I don't know if that's totally where we're headed, but you could see how quickly you get there.
I don't think that there's not people that want it to be there. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's some people that do want it to get there, and I think there's some larger powers, not even U.S. based, but like, you look at like World Economic Forum and those kind of like larger overarching global powers. Yeah. And I think that's what they would like to see. But then the 5G makes me think about like, okay, like headphones, like AirPods, or sleeping next to a phone that's charging, or
the phone itself up to your ear, which they literally tell you in the manual never to do.
Don't touch your head. Yeah.
Don't put a phone to your head. Like,
I do like to be a speakerphone guy.
Yeah. I mean, it works. People don't mind anymore. So what I have my patients do, you can make one out of a multimeter, but you can get a body voltage meter. Okay. You can buy one pre-made. You can make one out of a $20 multimeter, and you can measure how much voltage is going through your body, right? If you are sitting on your bed and there's a cell phone charger plugged in your bedroom, not being used, not charging a phone, just plugged into the wall, It will raise your body voltage in that room by at least 1 volt. Okay. What we know is anything above 0.5 volts suppresses hormone function in your brain. Okay. You've got your cell phone charger plugged in, and you can measure this yourself. It'll raise that by a volt. You're already over the ending point, right? You've got a sleep number, 3 volts, at least from my experiments, right? 3 volts, okay? You've got the breakers on in your room. You've got a computer. You've got a TV in your room. You've got a mattress that cools. You've got a bed frame that goes up and down. You're
How about
at 6.
a smart meter on the other side of your head?
A smart meter, right at that point, you might be at 10 volts, but on average, I'm seeing 6 to 8 volts suppression.
And that's just from it being in the room. I mean, I don't know if it's an EMF or...
Exactly, yes. That's the building's voltage, the building's outlets, it's the EMF, it's the electricity all around, the 5G, right? Heaven forbid you live close to a 5G tower. We had one patient, she was measuring 20 volts. There was a 5G tower outside of her apartment, right? She was not sleeping. She was frazzled. We couldn't figure out what it was at first. I was measuring mold. Finally, we figured out it was EMF. Sent her home with the body voltage meter, 20 volts in her room, right? And so we see there's health effects, but you can also start to play with it, right? You can start unplugging things. And so what we find if we track like sleep data, recovery from all the different biometrics, whether it's the rings or the watches or whatever, right? We can measure if you start lowering the voltage in a room, the body voltage in a room where you sleep, you will recover better and it's predictable, right? And so you can see these effects and you can measure it for yourself for $20.
And it's reproducible.
Yes.
Like those people in the blackout out west, bring them back into an EMFC, they get sick.
Yep.
And you can like even blind them and do that too, which is creepier. But the body is an electromagnetic machine, and we require very sensitive, specific, low voltage gradients to literally every single cell to move, whether it's neurons to move electricity, whether it's opening ion-gated voltage channels, whatever. And modern medicine gets down to about the level of the virion particle, which is tiny. It's tiny. But it ain't quantum level.
Yeah.
I mean, when we're talking about quantum interference, that's physics. That's biophysics domain. And medicine doesn't see it. It's sort of like ultraviolet or infrared or microwaves. Like, well, I can't see it, therefore it doesn't exist. And that's going to be the big change, I think, in hopefully our lifetime, but probably the next 100 years, is they will be able to tie more quantum effects below that cellular level, which cell biology is the very first course I took in medical school. It starts with the cell. It's the basic unit of life. Everything on there up. Well, cells are complicated. They're super complicated. They have all kinds of stuff going on. Let's study what makes up organelles. Let's study all the way down, like I said, to the quantum level. It makes a lot of sense how EMF can interfere with biology, healthy or unhealthy.
So, I mean, I guess I just started daydreaming of like what would I feel like if you took me and put me in like the 1600s, you know, where there was none, there was no cell towers, there's no freaking
food would be better,
freaking electricity was hard to come by. You know what I mean? Like that kind of stuff was like, what would it feel like for the average person? Would we just be like, whoa, like,
letdown effect.
Like you'd almost feel like something like all weight was just lifted off you, like you're not being bombarded by things all of a sudden, because you know it's the slow chipping effect. Like one day you feel more 5G, then the next day you feel a little more, then more the next day as towers go up, and then it's just normal.
Frog in the pot.
We're pretty adaptable people.
What we see, right? So some patients who are sensitive will essentially create a Faraday cage around the bed or a grounding mat at least to try to get that voltage close to zero. 1 to 2 nights when we do that, it's harder, right? Because it's almost like withdrawal from all of the extra EMF input, 5G, all that stuff. And then after that, they sleep like nobody's business. It's like that, what you're saying, like, oh, their body's like, thank you.
Yeah.
Like I needed that. I was so here's what's interesting, right? We talked about one of my specialties is mold, right? And mold is a living organism. And it produces a defense mechanism, mycotoxins. It's trying to defend itself. What we know from the research is you put that in the exposure of 5G, it produces up to 600 times more mycotoxins. What does that mean? It's trying to defend itself against the 5G. It's viewing that as a threat. Mold, a non-human organism, is viewing the 5G as a threat by producing more mycotoxins, right? It's
like a
threatening to our
dog
system.
whistle.
Yeah, it really is.
It
You
knows
can't hear
that
it,
it's
but
there,
yes.
like really knows, and like we're kind of just missing it because there's a million other things that humans are dealing with, and that's always one of my arguments with, or one of my thoughts with this is like, yeah, nobody can worry about the 5G tower because they're worried about so many other damn things.
That's true too.
Yeah.
Nobody has the bandwidth to think about that.
No.
Or think about mold. So we know that, let's say the EMF doesn't interfere with the cell. We're made up more of non-human cells than we are human cells. So we're actually more of a slave to bacteria and viruses. So we make them sick, pissed off, put them in defense mode. Then we start on our way up, cell danger response, immune reactivity, all the way up to end organ damage. Then it's sort of an esoteric argument. Was the 5G bad for the human cell or the DNA cutting or whatever? Or did it make you sick? The end is you're sick. And I think a lot of the ways, like how you found out the cause of that illness is really with history, common sense, which you have a ton of. Like, geez, this person's always sick, but then when they go to live up north, or they go on a trip or a cruise, their symptoms remit. That makes us think more about environmental exposures, everything from, mold to 5G.
That almost seems like the crazy part too. You almost have to be like, Dr. House, where it's like, all right, I guess I'm going to this person's home, and
Never really saw that show.
It's a good show. Yeah.
pretty good. I mean, he would go to the house and he would poke around and figure it out from there, kind of like look through everything, and usually that's how he kind of
Well, being a jerk in the process.
Well,
An eccentric genius
most geniuses
jerk.
are. Yeah.
also addicted to painkillers the whole time. So it was, kind of had that
He had the
element to
cane.
it.
His downfalls, yeah. It was, it's interesting when patients say, what type of medicine do you practice? Investigative, right? We're investigating what's going on. That's what House did. He was investigating, right? That was the cool part, but expert diagnostician. But you got to investigate, figure out what's going on.
People loved House because he was a doctor who asked why.
Yes.
And that's a novel concept.
Yeah.
And they were almost making the leap that that's something doctors never ask.
Well, it was also
yeah.
interesting because he mistrusted every other diagnosis that any doctor brought to him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He would always assume they were wrong. And that's kind of probably where my distrust of the medical industry came
Well,
from.
I do that. I do that too, and I don't know why I'm wired that way. But like if somebody shows up and they got a long list of diagnoses, even from early on, I'm like, okay, trust but verify. Now I'm more like distrust and verify. But I've always been wired that way, to really kind of look at the cause, the long-term course and the treatment interventions not being more harmful, because a lot of these medical treatments, like during COVID, are either non-existent or they worsen the situation. Like, well, let's just give more vaccines.
So, is there any frequencies or EMFs that might actually be beneficial on the other side of things? Because it seems like if it could be used in a negative way, it seems like there could be a flip side to it where the right wave could be used in a positive way. I was joking about that with a car buddy of mine who drove his car like 900 miles, and he's like, oh, it makes this like certain RPM. I'm like, this like certain hum and vibration. I'm like, it could be healing. It could be.
Oh yeah, therapeutic. Yeah,
Definitely.
yeah. There's what we call PEMF, which is pulsed electromagnetic fields, which are therapeutic EMFs, right? Therapeutic frequencies, and so you can view different ones. We were talking with a patient today about one that upregulates circulation by like 36%, right? Very healing, great for cellular repair. And there's different ones where sometimes if patients have a broken bone, I'll put a couple electrical pads and we'll put a couple frequencies that are known to be tissue healing and bone healing. And what we've seen, instead of taking 6 to 8 weeks to heal a fracture, it can take more like 3 to 4.
And that's
wow.
established. That's well-established medical science. But
Yeah, like athletes are probably using that.
yeah, I mean, Japanese researcher in the water, it was related to frequency vibration, sound bowls, immersion therapies, ultrasound. I mean, absolutely. But figuring that Rife machine, there's all kinds of electromagnetic frequencies and vibrations, acoustic energies, directed engine weapons that can be tuned for health and destruction of very specific things, like, I don't know, Lyme spirochetes, for instance. Yeah. And there's ones that absolutely are just a bull in a china shop that go in and just pretty much rave about anybody and everything in between. I think the science of the future, and Tesla was really talking about, is figuring out, thinking of the universe as vibration, amplitude, frequency, harmonics, and figuring out what promote health and why, ideally, and what promote disease. And do they change? That's another layer to it. So maybe what's healthy to you one day as your biology, physiology shifts its state, it's unhealthy at a later. Schumann resonance, cymatics. These are all really cool fields.
So will the ice baths be taken over by sound, like vibration baths, I guess?
I mean, combine them.
Yeah, you can do both. Well, that's a good idea. That's actually really, I was gonna say, yeah, can we?
People spend like 10 grand on those freaking ice baths.
That's right.
And the sauna machine and the saunas and stuff. People have the
hot
whole
cold, yeah.
You might as well add in another resonant frequency to it, I guess, at that point, just start shaking them.
I mean, neurofeedback does something similar, binaural beats, where you can, create a certain frequency in this ear, a certain frequency matching in this ear, and just change them. So the frequency itself might not, it's the difference in the frequency. So if you're wanting to create like a 3 hertz or 10 hertz, transcranial magnetic stimulation uses induction, similar to like how 5G would, where electromagnetic beams, I can hold a magnet next to this TV screen, it's going to interfere with the signal.
Yeah.
Similarly, 5G interferes with our signals, electro and chemically, pissing off mold, pissing off amalgam illnesses, pissing off, innate harmonic frequencies that are everything. The earth, every cell vibrates at a frequency. So to think that Tesla was wrong because he was old, I think is very blind, a blind analysis, and probably going to be laughed at, hopefully in our lifetime, but in the near future.
That'd be another one of, I think his papers were also taken by the CIA at the time, and that'd be another one nice to see come out.
Oh yeah,
maybe
is that supposed to be released?
Nobody's ever talked about it from what I've heard, but I know that they have the papers.
Yeah,
they're somewhere, right? They got to be.
It's almost like the Vatican Library. Who knows what's really in there?
Oh, yeah, there's some weird stuff down there, I'm sure.
Yeah.
The catacombs down under the Vatican, those have always intrigued me a little bit. But so then, you talk about all these things that are seemingly unavoidable. 5G is unavoidable. Mold, probably mostly unavoidable at this point, and most people probably have a negative reaction to it and don't know it.
Right.
You would probably say most of the world has a negative reaction to mold currently.
Correct.
But how do you avoid that? How do you fortify your house against mold?
Yeah, so, on both fronts, I would say first we got to take a harm reduction approach, right? Like we know we're not going to get away from all of it, but can we minimize the amount so it's not as negative? And then can we eliminate at least the most harmful, right? So we know mold is going to be present, but only some molds produce really toxic effects. And so can we eliminate those molds? And the same thing with EMF, right? Like, okay, I know EMF's going to be toxic or it's going to be present forever, but I probably don't want to build, if I'm going to build a house, I won't build a smart meter attached to my home, right? Can I build it 20 yards away, which they can do for you, right? And even now, if you guys are listening and you don't want that smart meter attached to your house, you can have it moved so that it's still on your property, but away from your home. And then the effects decrease, right? So we can modulate the effects to a point that it's as minimized as a negative health effect as possible.
So just trying to minimize it at that point, because that's scary in itself. We're not even talking about, getting rid of the issue. We're just talking about trying to fight it.
That's a reality, yeah.
I mean, I'm a big fan of human evolution, and it's in the adaptive strategy. I think the studies of Chernobyl are really kind of eyebrow raising. But there's no guarantee that this technology is something that we can adapt to in the time of its escalation. It's like, is our brain going to evolve as fast as AI is going to evolve? No. We're probably very close, if not past some sort of inflection point already. Mm-hmm. Definitely within our lifetime. The human brain will not evolve that fast. It just simply can't. So I think it's, if I could summarize medical school in one word, it would be moderation. So yes, I know there's awful ultra-processed food out there. Therefore, I don't eat it 3 times a day. If I had enough strength and willpower and discipline and a squawking body, I could totally cut it out. But if I do I like to have Chick-fil-A on Sundays, So every time I go there, they're closed.
I was wondering where you're going with that.
So, I mean, being aware, education is the first thing. Looking at mitigation strategies, whether that's, you can have your smart meter actually removed. You pay another $20 a month because the guy's got to get out of his truck and walk his butt up and look at it. But, geographic cures, mold testing, I'm thinking about amalgam, is having a functional, integrative, investigative doctor say, why are you sick, is where it begins. Then there are all kinds of mitigation strategies that you can do that don't totally remove, but like to your point, get her away from the cell phone tower. I had a girl the other day, she'd been sick, her entire life, allergies, tonsils out, all that. She was allergic to a tree outside of her bedroom window. As soon as she went to college, she was cured. So something like that, that's common sense. But do you think a doctor's ever going to figure that out or ask that or is even remotely trained in that? No. And that's tragic. Like I measure I like outcomes based on results, not algorithms. Like, well, I'm supposed to prescribe this drug or do this test. I want to know that person got better. And if they're not getting better, it's because I'm missing something. I'm missing something. So then we start thinking further and further outside of the box. That should have happened during the pandemic, because we didn't have established site. And the greatest failure of our system, I think, happened then because of our unwillingness to literally ask why and think outside the box in a time where clearly desperate times required some expansion, not even desperate measures, but common sense.
I mean, that's all a lot. I was thinking a little bit more about, talking about the evolution, and it just takes humans so long.
Massively long, yeah.
It's insane the amount of time that it would take a genetic change to occur with how slow we are to reproduce. I mean, talking 500 years, we'll get through what, 5-6 generations of people? That's like nothing. 7 maybe, like
micro changes. With the time frame you're talking, micro changes. And then in our current time frame, we're updating technology every 3 to 6 months massively, like on a logarithmic scale. Like, oh yeah, we can't adapt to that.
Well, it's talked about a little bit in like cars and racing. It's like, yeah, humans can't, like, it's hard for us to comprehend like 100-mile-an-hour acceleration that quickly. Like, of course, people crash their cars all the time. It's like we were walking our whole existence, basically. We were walking or horseback, and then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, now you can go 200 in the next 6 seconds. Great.
Or 304.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the top fuel guys, they go, what, 350 in 3.5 seconds, 6 seconds, like that. Like, they're flying. Like, how do you comprehend that as just like a human that realistically didn't experience this?
Unless you're reactivating genes, which is, I think, what happened in Chernobyl, and that should be really kind of studied and looked at. Evolution, natural selection, random mutation, that takes eons. It could take millions of years. And it's part of why microbes like mold don't have any previous experience in their genetic makeup to electromagnetic energy. So all they know is danger, and like the upregulation of the defense is wildly different. Therefore, their adaptation to it, and thus ours, is going to be way off in the future. Whereas the ionizing radiation thing is kind of crazy. These frogs ended up getting darker skin to help, and all of the adaptive changes. Then the wolves and the dogs, it's really shocking because it goes against that idea of, well, this place is an exclusion zone for 50,000 years or something crazy like that. Nothing's going to live there and not have, an arm growing out of its forehead. Mm-hmm. They're thriving. That's unusual.
Yeah, it almost doesn't make sense. Yeah. And even people live in Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well. People live in 3 Mile Island still.
Yeah.
We're not really, doesn't seem to be really affecting much. Kind of leads a lot of questions. What would you say would be the bigger breakthrough that you're hoping to have come to medical science then? Would it be on the mold front? Would it be on bacteria front, virus stuff? Like, what is the one that's like, man, we really need like this door to unlock? Gene therapy type of things where we really understand the genome?
That's a toughie.
Yeah, I would say, one area that I think's been impressive is like cellular function expression that we were missing, right? So we were looking at big disease processes before, like how did bacteria move in the blood, et cetera. But what's really amazing is like cell to cell communication. And then how does each one of those affect moving further, right? So, well, we see some of the more modern, actually it was originally in autism research, but we find it is the mechanism now behind long COVID is this cell danger response that Mark was talking about a second ago, which is like the cells literally change their entire environment and their communication strategies to go from energy making, metabolic function to defense. And I think if we can keep pushing, what are the exact things that turn that on? What turn it off? What do we need in that? When's it appropriate? When's it inappropriate? That sort of thing on that deeper of a level, that influences multiple disease rates, energy production, hibernation between seasons, obesity, right? And so what we're even noticing now is like, look, is it diet and exercise? It is to some degree, but it's really how those affect the cells, because if we have a cellular damage, you can diet and exercise all you want, you might not lose any fat. Right? And so we see that it's really down. So to me, it would be, and I want to hear your theories as well, but it would be how do they communicate and how do they change function to adapt to the environment so we can switch that on and off better, more predictably at least.
That's probably a better answer than I got, but I did get a visual on that. Some cells charge ahead, like a joust master. Some cells jog, some cells walk, some cells loiter and stand, and some are on their back heels in defense, and some are shooting their way out of the corner, or they're on life support. So it's this huge spectrum of literally anything and everything that can shift that balance between defensiveness, offensive, maintaining the status quo. My example probably wasn't as good, but I think, and this is partially because I lived through it, I think that the amount of heavy metal toxicity since the Industrial Revolution is one of those linchpins that a lot of times can be pulled out, and therefore make 5G less dangerous, therefore make, the reaction to mold illness or candida blues and some of these other syndromes we see go along with it, kind of make a house of cards. And so I was thinking to your point, where's the best target? If we could remove one thing or enlighten that, it would have a ripple effect. But I like your answer better.
Yours is good.
I like the idea of the heavy metals, because that's a worrying one. I mean, lead poisoning type of thing goes back forever. I mean, we learned about that in Roman history.
Yeah,
yeah. Lead poisoning was pretty bad, and then paint chips again, and I have my questions about why.
Racing fuel.
Yeah, there's no lead in fuel anymore.
There's racing fuel.
To keep the knockdown.
Yeah.
But, I mean, we don't need it anyways. But, yeah, even, like, I used to make the joke about the walls being lead painted, so you didn't need a tinfoil hat in here.
That's right.
But then you're like, man, there's kind of some validity to that, because it would probably be pretty good to be in a lead room to do things. You wouldn't get hit with everything.
There's some benefits if you don't touch it, lick it, or get too close to it.
Yeah. If you just kind of, it's over there and you ignore it a little bit. Right?
It won't guard you against neutrinos, but luckily those would pass through, I think, 100,000 miles of lead without whacking into anything.
Yeah, they've done pretty good.
So we don't need to worry about that.
Interesting. Well, there's a lot of other stuff I'm sure we could go for hours, but I'm going to end this off here. I know you're big on Instagram and social media, so I'd love to plug some of your stuff, and I'll put everything in the description, of course, if you want to tell us where people can go to get a hold of you and be treated by you guys, where people can learn more about this stuff, and whatever we can promote.
Yeah, appreciate that. We're on Instagram, Facebook pretty consistently, Keystone Total Health, and then KeystoneTotalHealth.com if they're interested in care, figuring out some investigative medicine, chronic illness, that sort of thing. Yeah, we're very active on that front, interact on a regular basis.
Awesome. Yeah, because I'm sure, there's plenty of people that need that, and they don't know where to find people like you guys.
Yeah, and they'll travel. You know, he's in Columbia, Tennessee, and he has intensives. People come from all over the world, and they get better, and that's so rewarding. That's why we're here.
People getting better, that's definitely a goal if you get treatment. And I'm sure there's plenty of people that would love to get better. And Mark, your practice Mind Body Health in Sarasota, Florida, right? Or is that in Brady?
Yeah, Mind Body Medicine of Florida is in Sarasota.
Okay, yeah. So Sarasota, Mind Body Medicine, awesome practice. You guys should go check them both out if you need any of this stuff. Everything's in the description. And thank you guys so much for coming on. I'm sure we could do this for another many of hours because we didn't even touch on a lot of crazy things going on.
Really enjoyed it.
Appreciate it. Thanks.